You know, life has a lot of highs and lows. It's a constant balancing act of good times and tragic times. And that's especially true for the man of the hour, Agostino Di Bartolomei, who was about to face Liverpool on May 1984 in a European Cup final. This would be the game of his life, as he would be the first Roma captain to lift the European Cup. And the occasion was even more special because the final was held in Rome at the Stadio Olimpico. Yes, he was about to become immortal in the pantheon of Romans, but fate had a different plan for Agostino. Not just that night, but also before and after that fateful game. Today, we're gonna talk about the rise and the tragedy of the greatest player to have never been capped at international level. One whose life was tragically ended at age 39 and is remembered as one of the greatest Italian players on and off the pitch. But the question is, what makes the story of Agostino Di Bartolomei so special to us? Well, stick around to find out. Right, so let's go all the way back to the early 80s. The world was going through the last decade of the Cold War, and Michael Jackson's Thriller album was ruling the music charts. But even more importantly to football fans, Agostino Di Bartolomei was one of the most respected and cultured midfielders of his era, who was the leader of one of the most feared teams in Europe alongside Bruno Conti, Roberto Falcao, and Carlo Ancelotti. Yes, the Carlo Ancelotti. Anyway, he captained Roma to their historic league title of 1983, which was their first in more than 4 decades, and only the second in their entire history. He was tall, elegant, and skillful, with a fantastic vision and technical ability. He played the role of regista, a deep playmaker in a role similar to Andrea Pirlo of recent years. He was a master of dictating the game like a true orchestra conductor. Things were going well for Roma. They were determined, they were dominant, and they were the kings of Italy at the time. But they had their eyes on a far bigger prize, a trophy that was never won by Roma in its entire history before. They wanted to become the kings of Europe, and not just win it, but win it in front of their own fans, as the European Cup final was being hosted in Rome. That being said, Roma's European dreams nearly ended in semi-final, as they lost the first leg to Dundee United 2-0. And yes, Dundee was pretty good at the time. Anyway, Roma didn't plan on crashing out of a tournament that they worked so hard for. So on the return match, they go 2-0 up before halftime. At the current score, the aggregate would have been 2-2. But then, the moment had come. In the second half, Roma was awarded a penalty. Taking that penalty was a huge responsibility for anyone, let alone one on the cusp of reaching a European final, after a miraculous comeback. But Agostino Di Bartolomei wasn't just any man. With the weight of the whole city on his shoulders, he converts the penalty, and Roma reached the final to be played in the same stadium, this time against Liverpool. Agostino described the final against Liverpool as the game of his life, and honestly, it's hard to disagree with him. After all, there was a European final to be played, and not to mention in front of your own home crowd. In front of his own fans, Agostino was undoubtedly the man of the match, as he was at the center of every move made by Roma. After a 1-1 draw, the game was left in the hands of the penalties. Despite Agostino scoring from the spot, it was Liverpool that won the final at Rome. It was supposed to be the coincidence of fates. Everything seemed prepared to make history in front of your own fans, but it couldn't be further from reality. In an alternate history, Roma would have been the champions of Europe, with Agostino Di Bartolomei lifting the cup in front of their own fans. But it wasn't meant to be. It was a dark day for Roma and Agostino himself, as this was one of his final games that he played for Roma. But that wasn't the end of the story. Things were about to change, in football, in Rome, and in Agostino Di Bartolomei's life as well. And before we talk about what happened to Agostino after Roma, a lot of time goes into making these videos. So your like and comments really mean a lot to me, and it really helps out the YouTube algorithm as well, as this is a young channel. Incredibly, the final ended up being one of Agostino's last games for Roma, as after the arrival of Sven-Goran Eriksson as coach, he was strangely allowed to leave and join Milan. It was a transfer that he bitterly opposed and gave a number of interviews in which he declares his undying love for Roma. Just a month into his career at Milan, he faced his old teammates, and as fate would have it, Di Bartolomei actually scored as Milan won 2-1. That being said, by the 1980s, his position was beginning to disappear, as coaches began to favor midfielders who could press and tackle back. This was an era in which steel was preferred over art and flair. Perhaps that explains why Di Bartolomei was never called up for the Italian national team, as they preferred steel and substance over flair and fantasy of Di Bartolomei. He moved on again and spent the rest of his career in smaller clubs before retiring from football in 1990. After his retirement, Roma didn't offer him anything. After 15 years of fantastic service, Roma seemed to abandon one of their greatest ever players. Agostino began to suffer from severe depression in his later years of his career, and it didn't help that after retirement, he struggled to adapt to a world outside of football. He got into financial trouble when a number of business plans went wrong, including an attempt to open a football school. The burden of depression was too heavy for Agostino to carry. On the morning of May 30th, 1994, Agostino walked into the balcony of his home and shot himself through the heart, with his farewell note written, "I feel locked inside a hole. I can't see any way out." The date of Agostino's death was really striking. It was exactly 10 years after Roma's loss to Liverpool in that European Cup final. Whether it was a coincidence or not, I guess we'll never know. I hope you have an appreciation for one of the lesser known jewels of the sport, perhaps the greatest player to have never been capped internationally, a legend in the long history of Italian football, a rare gentleman of the sport who was brilliant on as well as off the pitch. I'm Football Drawn, and I like to tell football stories with comic and drawings. If you enjoyed this video, check out the rest of the channel as well.